Nathaniel Greer was face down on scorching asphalt in Richmond, Virginia. A knee crushed the space between his shoulder blades and ground him into the pavement like he was nothing. Handcuffs bit into his wrists so tight his fingers went numb. He was wearing tactical body armor. He spoke calmly. "I am a federal agent." Officer Brett Lockhart laughed above him and told him to stop talking. Then Nathaniel felt it. The cold steel of a gun muzzle pressed against the base of his skull. In the distance, the roar of approaching engines. What happened next would end Greer's collapse a department and expose a murder that had been buried for over a year. 6 hours earlier, at 4:30 in the morning, Nathaniel Greer woke in the darkness of his bedroom 2 full minutes before his alarm was set to ring. He did not move immediately. He lay still, listening to the slow breathing of his wife, Camille, beside him. Feeling the warmth of the house around him, the ordinary peace of a family asleep and unaware. Then he rose without a sound, moving through the dark hallway, with the practiced silence of a man who had done this more times than he could count. He dressed in the bathroom with the door closed, pulling on dark cargo pants and a black compression shirt lacing his boots, tight, checking the fit of his tactical vest. Every motion was deliberate, rehearsed, controlled. He stopped in the doorway of his children's bedroom on the way to the stairs. His son, 12 years old, was curled beneath a blanket covered in basketball logos. His daughter, 9, slept with one arm draped over the edge of the bed and her braids fanned across the pillow. Nathaniel stood there for 3 seconds, maybe 4, feeling 2 opposing forces live inside his body at the same time. The tenderness of a father who wanted nothing more than to protect the people in that room. And the steel of a federal agent who understood that every time he walked out the front door in tactical gear, there existed a version of the day where he did not come back. He exhaled quietly and went downstairs. He poured coffee into a thermos, checked his service weapon, holstered it, and stepped into the Virginia pre-dawn. The air was already thick with humidity. Summer in Richmond never waited for the sun before it started pressing down. He drove through empty streets, the headlights of his unmarked sedan cutting through fog that settled low over the James River, and crept through the neighborhood south of the city. He thought about his cousin Terrence Stokes as he drove. He thought about Terrence almost every morning now. 1 year ago, Terrence had been found dead in a motel bathroom on the south side of Richmond, needle in his arm, fentanyl in his bloodstream. The death was ruled an accidental overdose, and the case was closed within a week. But Nathaniel could not accept that conclusion because Nathaniel knew his cousin. Terrence had been clean for 5 years. 5 years of sobriety meetings and sponsor calls, and rebuilding his life one careful day at a time. Terrence had a job at a shipping warehouse. He had an apartment with furniture he had picked out himself. He was talking about going back to school. And then one Tuesday morning he was dead, on a motel bathroom floor with a needle in his arm, and the world moved on like it made perfect sense. But it did not make sense. Not to Nathaniel. Not then, and not now. 3 weeks after Terrence's funeral, Nathaniel had requested a transfer from the FBI's white-collar crime division to the Violent Crimes Task Force, specifically to the drug trafficking unit focused on fentanyl distribution in central Virginia. His supervisors questioned the move. It was a lateral step at best, a dangerous one at worst. Nathaniel told them he wanted to do more impactful work. He did not tell them he wanted to find the supply chain that put the needle in his cousin's arm and burn it to the ground. That was a year ago. Today, the work reached its peak. At 6 in the morning, Nathaniel stood at the head of a conference table in a secure briefing room at the FBI Richmond field office. 12 agents sat in front of him. The overhead lights cast a flat, clinical glow across the maps and photographs spread across the table. The target was a fentanyl distribution hub operating out of an abandoned warehouse complex on Richmond's south side. The operation code, named Crossfire, had been built over 9 months of relentless work. Surveillance, wiretaps, controlled purchases, confidential informants. 3 primary targets ran the operation from inside the warehouse network, and today was the day the door came down. The raid was scheduled for 11 in the morning. Calvin Oakes, a broad-shouldered tactical agent with 8 years on the entry team, would lead the breach. Supervisory Special Agent Raymond Kemp, Nathaniel's direct superior, stood at the back of the room with his arms folded and gave the final authorization with a single nod. Kemp reminded the room of one critical detail. Local law enforcement had been deliberately excluded from the operation. Intelligence gathered over the past 4 months indicated that someone within the Richmond Police Department had been leaking information to the drug targets. Twice in the past year, planned enforcement actions in the South Side had been mysteriously anticipated by the suspects, who vanished hours before execution. The leak had not been identified. Therefore, no Richmond PD officer had been informed of today's raid, and no local cooperation had been requested. Every agent in the room understood the implication. They were operating in a city where the police themselves could not be trusted. At 9:33 hours before the scheduled breach, Nathaniel received a call from a confidential informant. The informant's voice was low and hurried. The warehouse was active right now. Product was being moved. Vehicles were loading in the rear lot. Something had changed, and the timeline had shifted. Nathaniel made a decision. He would drive to the target area alone to conduct advanced surveillance and confirm whether the early activity was real, before pulling the trigger on an accelerated operation. He radioed Kemp and informed him. Kemp approved but told him to observe only and maintain distance. Nathaniel grabbed his tactical gear, his body armor, and his service weapon. He folded his FBI windbreaker, the one with the large yellow letters across the back, and placed it in the trunk. His badge hung on a lanyard around his neck, tucked beneath the body armor, where it would not swing freely. At 10 in the morning, Nathaniel parked on a side street 2 blocks east of the warehouse complex. He killed the engine and scanned the area through the windshield. The neighborhood was a skeleton of what it had once been. Crumbling row houses with plywood over the windows, empty lots choked with weeds pushing through cracked concrete. A shuttered grocery store with faded letters still advertising prices from a decade ago. This stretch of Richmond's South Side had been a thriving black community, once full of families and churches and corner stores, where everybody knew your name. Decades of disinvestment, redlining, factory closures, and political neglect had hollowed it out, and now the same streets were being poisoned by the very drugs Nathaniel had spent the last year trying to stop. He lifted a pair of binoculars and focused on the warehouse compound. He could see the main structure, a long cinder block building with a corrugated metal roof partially hidden behind a row of overgrown trees. No visible activity from this angle. He shifted his view south toward the access alley, and then his hands went still. A Richmond PD patrol car was parked in the alley adjacent to the warehouse. No lights, no engine running, no visible officer activity. It was just sitting there, positioned with a clear line of sight to the warehouse's rear loading entrance. Ice moved through Nathaniel's veins. No Richmond officer had been informed of this operation. No local police had any reason to be within a mile of this warehouse today. Either this was a coincidence of staggering proportion, or someone within the Richmond Police Department was not just leaking information, but was physically present to coordinate with the targets. Nathaniel stepped out of his vehicle to get a closer look, and that was the moment everything began to unravel. Nathaniel moved along the sidewalk with his right hand resting near his hip, close to the holstered service weapon, but not touching it. He spoke quietly into the lapel radio clipped to his vest, transmitting his location and reporting the presence of the Richmond PD patrol car to the FBI Operations Center. He gave the car's position relative to the warehouse. He requested a plate check. He was mid-sentence when a voice cracked through the air behind him like a gunshot. The word was simple. Stop. but the way it was delivered carried nothing that resembled a professional command. It was raw and territorial, loaded with something that had nothing to do with law enforcement, and everything to do with what the speaker saw when he looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel turned slowly, keeping his hands visible. Officer Brett Lockhart stood 15 feet away, having emerged from behind a section of chain-link fence that bordered the alley. His weapon was drawn and aimed directly at the center of Nathaniel's chest. Lockhart was a big man, 6'2", 220 pounds, with a sunburned neck and pale blue eyes that sat flat in his face, like two coins pressed into clay. His jaw was set, his shoulders squared forward, and his feet were planted wide in a stance that had nothing to do with assessment and everything to do with aggression. He was not a police officer evaluating a situation. He was a man who had already reached his conclusion. He had looked at Nathaniel and seen a black man in dark tactical clothing standing near a known drug zone, and that was the only information he needed. The verdict had been delivered before a single word was spoken. Lockhart barked the command again. "On the ground, now! Hands where I can see them. Do not move!" Nathaniel raised both hands slowly, palms open, fingers spread. He kept his voice calm and measured, speaking with the deliberate clarity of a man who understood that the next 5 seconds could determine whether he lived or died. "I am FBI Special Agent Nathaniel Greer. My badge is around my neck beneath my vest. I am conducting authorized federal surveillance in this area. I need you to lower your weapon." Lockhart did not process a single word. Or if he did, he discarded every one of them like trash blown across a sidewalk. He screamed at Nathaniel to stop reaching. Nathaniel was not reaching for anything. His hands were in the air, empty, open, motionless. But Lockhart saw what he wanted to see. He closed the distance in 4 fast strides, and before Nathaniel could repeat his identification, Lockhart's free hand seized the back of Nathaniel's neck with a grip that felt like a steel clamp. The takedown was violent and practiced. Lockhart drove Nathaniel forward and down, slamming him face first into the asphalt with the full force of his body weight behind the motion. Nathaniel's left cheekbone struck the pavement, and the pain was immediate and blinding, a white flash that exploded behind his eyes and sent a ringing through his skull. His palms scraped across the rough surface, skin tearing. Before he could orient himself, Lockhart dropped his full weight onto Nathaniel's back, planting a knee directly on his spine between the shoulder blades. Lockhart wrenched Nathaniel's arms behind his back one at a time, twisting them at angles that sent fire through his shoulders and snapped the handcuffs shut. The metal bit into Nathaniel's wrists with such force that he felt the skin split beneath the steel edges. Blood began seeping from the abrasion within seconds. Nathaniel kept talking through the pain, because his training told him that silence in a situation like this was interpreted as guilt, and his experience as a black man in America told him that silence in a situation like this could also be interpreted as a reason to pull the trigger. He spoke through gritted teeth, each word measured and precise. "I am a federal agent. Look at my badge. It is on a lanyard around my neck. You need to look at it right now." Lockhart leaned down, grabbed the lanyard, and yanked the badge out from beneath the body armor. He held it in front of his face for half a second, maybe less, then dropped it onto the pavement beside Nathaniel's bleeding cheek. "Fake," he said. "I have seen these knockoff badges sold on the street for $20. Then he added in a tone that was almost casual, almost amused, like a man telling a joke he had told 100 times before. "Your kind always has a story." Nathaniel lay there on the hot asphalt with blood running from his cheekbone and his wrists throbbing, and a 220-pound man grinding a knee into his spine, and he felt something he had spent his entire career learning to control. Fury. Not just at the pain or the humiliation, but at the specific, deliberate, centuries-old machinery of what was happening. He was a 14-year veteran of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He had a badge, a service weapon, tactical body armor, and a radio connected to a federal operations center. And none of it mattered. None of it registered. Because the man on his back had looked at him and seen only one thing, and that one thing had overridden every piece of evidence to the contrary. A second patrol car pulled up moments later. Officer Derek Fenwick stepped out younger, maybe late 20s, with a nervous energy that vibrated off him like heat from an engine. Fenwick looked at the scene, and something crossed his face that might have been discomfort or might have been doubt. He walked over, looked down at the badge lying on the pavement, and picked it up. He turned it over in his hands. He studied the holographic seal, the embossed lettering, the serial number engraved on the back. He told Lockhart this badge looked real. He said it looked like a genuine FBI credential. Lockhart cut him off with a sharp word and a sharper look. He told Fenwick they had caught someone casing the drug spot, and to run the man's name through dispatch. Fenwick hesitated, his eyes moving between Lockhart and Nathaniel, but he walked back to his patrol car and reached for the radio. Then Lockhart found the service weapon. He pulled it from Nathaniel's holster, and everything escalated. Lockhart drew his own weapon a second time, pressed the muzzle against the base of Nathaniel's skull, where the bone meets the spine, and held it there. The steel was warm from sitting in the holster under the Virginia sun. Lockhart leaned down close enough for Nathaniel to smell coffee and cigarettes on his breath, and he spoke in a voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, but so sharp it cut through every other sound on that street. He told Nathaniel he did not care what agency he claimed to represent. He said that, in this part of Richmond, Lockhart was the law. He said black men do not get to carry guns in his district. He said every black man with a badge was just a criminal who got lucky, and luck runs out. The temperature of the moment shifted. Nathaniel had been trained in hostage negotiation crisis de-escalation active threat assessment. He had faced armed suspects, cartel operatives, men who had killed before and intended to kill again. But lying on that asphalt with a gun pressed to his skull by a man in a police uniform who was speaking to him with the calm conviction of someone who believed that the color of Nathaniel's skin made him less than human, Nathaniel understood something with absolute clarity. This officer was not confused. He was not making a mistake that could be corrected with the right words or the right tone. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he did not care. Then Nathaniel heard it. Engines. Not the smooth hum of civilian traffic, but the deep, guttural roar of heavy vehicles moving fast, the kind of sound that only comes from armored SUVs running in formation. The noise grew rapidly, the vibration rippling through the pavement beneath Nathaniel's bleeding cheek, and in a span of seconds that felt like an eternity, compressed into a heartbeat. 3 black FBI tactical SUVs rounded the corner at the end of the block and braked hard. Tires screamed against asphalt. Doors flew open before the vehicles had fully stopped. Agents poured out in coordinated bursts, full tactical gear, helmets, ballistic vests. Rifles raised the letters FBI stamped in bright yellow across every chest. Calvin Oakes was first out of the lead vehicle. He moved with the focused aggression of a man trained to process a crisis in fractions of a second. But when his eyes swept the scene and found Nathaniel face down on the ground, face bleeding, wrists cuffed behind his back, a Richmond PD officer kneeling on his spine with a service weapon pressed to his head, Oakes froze. It lasted less than a second, that frozen moment, but it carried the weight of something that no training manual could prepare a man for. It was the sight of a colleague, a friend, a fellow agent treated like a criminal on the street of the city they were trying to protect. Oakes recovered instantly. He raised his rifle to low ready and shouted identification in a voice that echoed off every crumbling wall on the block. "Federal agents, lower your weapon now. Step away from the agent on the ground. That is a federal officer." More agents converged, forming a perimeter that closed around Lockhart and Fenwick like a contracting fist. Raymond Kemp arrived in the second vehicle, stepping out with the controlled authority of a man who had spent 22 years in federal law enforcement. He walked directly to Lockhart badge held high and identified Nathaniel by full name and rank. Special Agent Nathaniel Greer, Violent Crimes. Task Force FBI Richmond Field Office. Kemp's voice was level, but there was iron beneath it that dared Lockhart to challenge a single syllable. The recognition did not hit Lockhart the way it should have. There was no shame in his face, no guilt, no sudden realization of catastrophic error. What Nathaniel saw when he turned his head just enough to look up at the man who had been crushing him into the pavement was something closer to calculation. Lockhart was doing math. He was measuring the situation, weighing options, deciding how to position himself. He holstered his weapon slowly, deliberately, making the motion look casual rather than compliant. He unlocked the handcuffs and stepped back with a single phrase that he delivered like it explained everything and absolved him of all responsibility. He should have identified himself more clearly. Nathaniel rose from the pavement in stages, first to his knees, then to his feet. He stood in the Virginia heat with blood running from a 2-inch gash on his left cheekbone where the skin had split against the asphalt. Both wrists were ringed with raw red abrasions that wept blood where the handcuff edges had cut through skin. Dust and grit coated his tactical vest. He said nothing to Lockhart. He bent down, picked up his FBI badge from the ground where Lockhart had dropped it, and hung it around his neck. He looked at his team at Oakes and Kemp and the 10 other agents standing in the street with weapons at low ready, and he made a decision that cost him something no one watching could fully measure. He said, "The mission is still active. We move now." He swallowed every ounce of rage, every gram of humiliation, every volt of the electricity that was screaming through his nervous system, telling him to turn around and confront the man who had just ground his face into the street and pressed a gun to his skull and called him a criminal because of his skin. He swallowed it all because the job came first, because 9 months of work and a warehouse full of poison were more important than his pride or his pain. The team moved, but the damage was already done. The commotion of the confrontation, the patrol cars, the screeching arrival of 3 FBI tactical vehicles, the shouting, the weapons drawn in the open street, all of it had sent a signal through the neighborhood that traveled faster than any radio transmission. By the time the tactical team reached the warehouse compound and Calvin Oakes led the breach through the main entrance, the building was a ghost of what surveillance had shown just hours earlier. The primary product was gone. The tables where bricks of fentanyl had been stacked and packaged were bare except for scattered remnants of plastic wrap and trace residue. 2 low-level operators who had been too slow or too expendable to evacuate sat on the concrete floor with their hands raised, but the 3 primary targets, the men who ran the operation, had vanished. 9 months of preparation, hundreds of hours of surveillance, thousands of taxpayer dollars spent on wiretaps and controlled purchases, all of it gutted in the span of minutes. Nathaniel stood in the center of the empty warehouse, surrounded by the ghosts of the evidence that should have been there, and he stared at the bare tables where enough fentanyl to kill tens of thousands of people had been sitting that morning. He did not speak. He did not move. He just stood there, bleeding quietly from his cheek and his wrists, and absorbed the full weight of what had been lost. Kemp pulled him aside after the scene was secured and the 2 low-level operators were in custody. They stood near the rear loading dock, away from the other agents, and Kemp spoke in a tone that was urgent but controlled. He told Nathaniel something that reframed the entire incident in a single sentence. The FBI had suspected for months that someone within the Richmond Police Department was providing operational intelligence to the drug trafficking network. That suspicion was the reason local police had been excluded from the raid. But the presence of Lockhart's patrol car, parked in the alley adjacent to the warehouse before the raid was scheduled to begin, went beyond a leak. No Richmond officer had been dispatched to that location. No call for service existed. No legitimate police function explained Lockhart's presence. Kemp looked Nathaniel in the eyes and said what they were both already thinking. Lockhart may not have simply been racially profiling a black man in a drug zone. He may have been at the warehouse to warn the targets. The confrontation with Nathaniel may have been a diversion, a chaotic incident that consumed critical minutes and generated enough noise to signal the occupants of the warehouse that law enforcement was closing in. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. The result, a compromised raid and vanished suspects, was too convenient to be accidental. Nathaniel turned and looked back through the warehouse toward the street where Lockhart and Fenwick were still standing beside their patrol car, talking to each other with the casual posture of men who believed they had done nothing wrong. What Nathaniel had experienced on that asphalt was real. The racism was real. The violence was real. The gun against his skull was real. But now he understood that it might also be a thread connected to something far larger and far more dangerous than one officer's hatred, and he intended to pull that thread until the entire fabric came apart. 2 days later, Nathaniel sat in a sterile room at the Richmond PD Internal Affairs Division and filed a formal complaint against Officer Brett Lockhart. He submitted his written account in meticulous detail, covering every second of the encounter, from the first command to stop to the final removal of the handcuffs. He included photographs of the 2-inch laceration on his left cheekbone, which had required 7 stitches to close at the MedStar emergency room. He included photographs of both wrists showing the deep circumferential abrasions left by the handcuffs. He submitted a formal request for Lockhart's body camera footage from the incident. He also filed a duplicate copy of the complaint with the FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility, ensuring a federal record existed independent of anything the Richmond Police Department might do or fail to do. He did everything the system told him to do. He followed every procedure. He checked every box. And then the system showed him exactly what it was designed to protect. The response came within 48 hours, and it arrived not through official channels, but through a phone call from Captain Douglas Langford, directly to the FBI Richmond field office. Langford was the commanding officer of the precinct that covered Richmond's south side, the precinct that controlled Lockhart's patrol zone. Nathaniel had seen Langford's name in departmental records but had never met the man. What he heard through the grapevine from agents who took the call painted a portrait that was unmistakable. Langford was polished political and controlled a man who wore authority the way other men wore tailored suits, with an ease that suggested he had never known a day without it. Langford's version of the incident bore almost no resemblance to reality. According to Langford's Special Agent Greer, had been present in an active narcotics surveillance zone without visible law enforcement identification, wearing dark tactical clothing consistent with armed criminal suspects known to operate in that area. Officer Lockhart had followed standard department protocol for engaging a potentially armed and dangerous individual. The brief detention was a reasonable exercise of officer safety procedures. Langford stated that any physical contact was incidental to the lawful detention and that allegations of racial bias were unfounded, inflammatory, and damaging to interagency cooperation. He demanded that the FBI withdraw the complaint. The word demanded sat in Nathaniel's mind like a coal. Not requested. Demanded. 4 days after the complaint was filed, Officer Derek Fenwick submitted a written statement to Internal Affairs, supporting Lockhart's version of events in every particular. The statement described Nathaniel as uncooperative, hostile, and physically resistant to lawful commands. Nathaniel read Fenwick's statement in the FBI field office and recognized immediately that the language was not Fenwick's. The phrasing was too polished, too specific, too perfectly aligned with Lockhart's own account. Entire sentences mirrored each other word for word. Someone had coached Fenwick, or someone had written the statement for him and told him to sign it. Then came the body camera footage, or rather the absence of it. Internal Affairs reported that Officer Lockhart's body camera had experienced a technical malfunction during the period in question, and that no footage had been recovered. The email delivering this information was exactly 3 sentences long and offered no further explanation. Nathaniel stared at those 3 sentences for a long time. Body cameras do not selectively malfunction during the precise minutes that would incriminate the officer wearing them. That footage existed. Someone had made it disappear. The pressure then came from a direction Nathaniel had not anticipated, his own agency. Kemp called him into his office and closed the door. Kemp's tone was careful, almost apologetic, but the message was unambiguous. FBI leadership in Washington was reluctant to escalate a conflict with the Richmond Police Department. The drug investigation was still active, despite the compromised raid. Future operations in the South Side would require some measure of local cooperation. The complaint was creating friction at a level that made senior officials uncomfortable. Kemp did not say the words "let it go." He did not have to. The silence after he finished speaking said it for him. That night, Nathaniel sat at his kitchen table with Camille. She had seen the stitches in his cheek when he came home from the raid. She had seen the raw circles around his wrists, and she had held his hands while he told her what happened. And something in her face had collapsed inward, like a building losing its foundation. Now she sat across from him, and her eyes were wet, and her voice shook as she spoke. She told him she had seen what happens when black men fight the police. She had watched it on the news, read about it in the papers, heard the stories from her own father and brothers and cousins. She told him that she loved him, and that she was proud of him, and that she was terrified. She asked him to protect their children by stepping back. She said the word, "please," and it broke something in the room that neither of them could put back together. Nathaniel did not answer her immediately because the impossible weight of what she was asking pressed down on him with a force that rivaled the knee that had been on his back. She was asking him to choose between justice and safety. She was asking him to accept what had been done to him and move on, and she was not wrong to ask it, because the history of this country was littered with the bodies of black men who chose to fight and paid for it with everything they had. He held her hands across the table and told her he loved her. He told her he heard her. He did not tell her that he had already started digging, because what he had found that afternoon had changed the nature of everything. Using federal law enforcement databases, Nathaniel had pulled Lockhart's complete complaint history. 17 formal complaints had been filed against Officer Brett Lockhart over a span of 12 years. Every single complaint had been filed by a black or Latino man. Every single complaint had been dismissed by Internal Affairs under the authority of Captain Douglas Langford. But the pattern that stopped Nathaniel cold was not the complaints themselves. It was what happened after them. 3 of the men who had filed complaints against Lockhart were subsequently arrested on drug charges. In each case, the arrest occurred within 3 months of the complaint filing. In each case, the drug charges appeared out of nowhere with no prior investigative basis, no surveillance, no informant tips, no undercover purchases. The charges looked engineered. They looked fabricated. Someone was not just dismissing complaints against Lockhart. Someone was retaliating against the people brave enough to file them, and they were using the criminal justice system itself as the weapon of punishment. The retaliation against Nathaniel began within 7 days of his complaint filing, and it was methodical, relentless, and designed to communicate a single message. He was pulled over 3 times in 1 week by Richmond PD patrol officers, each stop initiated by a different officer using a different fabricated reason. The first stop was for a broken tail light. Nathaniel checked the taillight after the officer let him go. It was functioning perfectly. The second stop was for an improper lane change on Broad Street during the afternoon commute. Nathaniel had not changed lanes. The third stop was for an expired vehicle inspection sticker. His inspection was current for another 9 months. Each officer was polite on the surface, courteous, even using the kind of exaggerated professionalism that communicated its own form of menace. "Yes, sir." "No, sir." "Just doing our job, sir." But their eyes carried the real message flat, and knowing and cold. "We know who you are. We know what you filed. And we are everywhere." Then it reached his family. Camille found a parking citation tucked under the windshield wiper of her car on a Tuesday morning. The car was parked in their own driveway on their own property, in a residential neighborhood. The citation was for obstructing a public right-of-way. It was absurd, and it was deliberate, a hand reaching into his home to let him know that nowhere was safe. 3 days later, Camille received a phone call from her son's school. Her 12-year-old boy, Nathaniel Jr., had been stopped while walking home by a uniformed Richmond PD officer who claimed the boy matched the description of a suspect involved in a nearby theft. The officer detained the child for 11 minutes on the sidewalk, asking his name, his address, where he was coming from, where he was going, while other children walked past and stared. When Camille arrived at the school after receiving the call, her son was sitting in the front office with his hands gripping the straps of his backpack so tight his knuckles had gone pale. He asked his mother why the police stopped him. He asked her what he did wrong. Camille drove home, with her jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached, and tears running silently down her face, and when she walked through the front door she did not scream, and she did not collapse. She looked at Nathaniel, and her eyes held something beyond fear, something that lived in the marrow of every black parent who has ever watched the machinery of authority turn its gaze towards their child. That night, Nathaniel installed 4 security cameras around the perimeter of his house. At 2:17 in the morning 3 nights later, one of the cameras captured a Richmond PD patrol car pulling to a stop on the street directly in front of their home. Its lights were off, its engine idled. It sat there for 22 minutes without moving a dark shape in the dark street, and then it pulled away and disappeared into the night. 22 minutes. Long enough to make it a point. Long enough to steal sleep and replace it with vigilance. Nathaniel began reaching out to the men who had filed complaints against Lockhart and then been arrested. He found Jerome Dupree first. Dupree lived in a rented room on the east side of Richmond, a single room in a converted house with a shared bathroom and a hot plate on a folding table. 4 years ago, Dupree had been a mechanic at a repair shop on Hull Street, married with a lease on a 2-bedroom apartment and a credit score he was quietly proud of. Then Brett Lockhart pulled him over for a broken turn signal. During the stop, Lockhart searched Dupree's car without consent, found nothing, and before letting him go, leaned into the driver's side window and called Dupree a word that Dupree would not repeat to Nathaniel, but that Nathaniel did not need to hear to understand. Dupree filed a complaint with Internal Affairs the next day. 12 weeks later, during a routine traffic stop conducted by a different officer, a sealed plastic bag containing 4 grams of powder cocaine was discovered under Dupree's driver's seat. Dupree had never touched cocaine in his life. He was arrested, charged, prosecuted, and convicted. He served 2 years at the Greensville Correctional Center. When he was released, his wife was gone. His apartment was rented to someone else, and the repair shop had filled his position. He found the rented room, and he had been in it ever since. He told Nathaniel his story, sitting on the edge of a narrow bed, with his hands folded between his knees, and his voice was so flat, so emptied of everything, that it sounded like a man reading a weather report about his own destruction. Nathaniel then found Isaiah Poindexter. Poindexter had been a high school history teacher at a public school in the South Side, respected by students, valued by the administration, active in the community. One afternoon, he witnessed Lockhart slam a 16-year-old boy against the hood of a patrol car during a traffic stop. The boy was crying. Poindexter intervened verbally, asking the officer to use less force, and was told to walk away or be arrested. He walked away. But the next morning he filed a formal complaint. 11 weeks later, Poindexter was pulled over for a minor moving violation. During the stop, the situation escalated for reasons that were never clearly explained in the report. Poindexter was charged with resisting arrest. The arrest itself was physically violent enough to leave bruises on his arms and a cut above his left eye. The charge resulted in a conviction, and the conviction triggered an automatic review by the school board. His teaching license was revoked. His career evaporated. Poindexter now worked the night shift at a warehouse loading dock and had not stood in front of a classroom in 3 years. He told Nathaniel his story standing in the doorway of his apartment because he did not invite Nathaniel inside, and his eyes had the hollow, careful quality of a man who had learned that trust was a luxury he could no longer afford. But it was what Nathaniel found in the data that changed everything. Working late at the FBI field office, cross-referencing Lockhart's patrol routes against the drug operation's known distribution network, Nathaniel identified an overlap so precise it could not be coincidental. 90% of the drug ring's confirmed distribution territory fell within Lockhart's regular patrol zone. Every corner, every stash house, every hand-to-hand transaction point mapped directly onto the streets that Lockhart drove every shift. Nathaniel dug deeper. He pulled property records for the buildings the drug operation used as storage and distribution sites. 2 of those buildings were owned through a shell company registered in the state of Virginia. The registered agent of that shell company, the individual legally authorized to act on its behalf, was a woman named Patricia Langford, Captain Douglas Langford's wife. The architecture of the corruption revealed itself like a building stripped of its walls. Lockhart provided street-level protection, patrolling the drug territory, and ensuring that no one interfered with operations. Langford provided administrative cover from inside the department, killing complaints, deleting footage, coaching witnesses, and retaliating against anyone who threatened the arrangement. And together, through Patricia Langford's shell company, they profited from the same poison that was killing the black communities they had sworn to serve. Nathaniel spread the evidence across a conference table in a secure room at the FBI Richmond field office and asked Raymond Kemp to close the door. The 2 men stood on opposite sides of the table, and between them lay the collected architecture of 8 years of corruption. Lockhart's patrol route maps overlaid with the drug ring's distribution territory. Property records for the 2 buildings owned by the shell company. The incorporation documents showing Patricia Langford as registered agent. Bank records obtained through federal subpoena showing a pattern of cash deposits into accounts linked to the shell company that corresponded in timing and amount to the drug ring's known revenue cycles. The 17 complaint files all dismissed by Langford. The arrest records of the 3 men who filed complaints and were subsequently charged with fabricated drug crimes. Nathaniel watched Kemp's expression shift as he moved from document to document. It was not a sudden change. It was a slow migration, like watching weather move across a landscape. The cautious bureaucrat who had counseled patience and interagency cooperation gave way piece by piece to a man who understood that what he was looking at could not be managed or negotiated or smoothed over with a phone call. It was too large, too embedded, too dangerous to ignore. Kemp picked up the shell company documents, held them under the fluorescent light, and read Patricia Langford's name 3 times. Then he set them down and looked at Nathaniel and said 2 words. "How long?" Nathaniel told him the financial trail suggested the arrangement had been operating for approximately 8 years. Monthly cash payments flowed from the drug operation through the shell company's accounts and into personal accounts controlled by Langford's wife. Lockhart received his share in cash hand-to-hand untraceable except through the circumstantial pattern of his spending habits, which had been flagged by an FBI forensic accountant who noticed that a patrol officer earning $72,000 a year was making mortgage payments on a lakefront property in Chesterfield County worth $460,000. The total estimated revenue that had passed through the shell company structure over 8 years exceeded $2 million. Kemp authorized the investigation that afternoon. It would be a covert federal probe into Lockhart Langford and the full scope of their involvement with the drug trafficking operation. Completely separate from the compromised Operation Crossfire. New codename, Clean Team. No overlap with anyone who had touched the original case. Kemp chose the name himself. Operation Clean Sweep. Nathaniel worked nights and weekends for the next 3 weeks building the case with a small team of agents and forensic accountants who understood the stakes and the secrecy required. He slept 4 hours a night. He lost 11 pounds. Camille watched him deteriorate and said nothing because she had seen the look in his eyes and recognized it as something that could not be argued with or bargained away. It was the look of a man who had found the thread and would die pulling it before he let go. The body camera footage changed everything for the 3rd time. Sandra Hewitt was a black woman in her early 40s who had worked in the Information Technology Division of the Richmond Police Department's Records Management Unit for 11 years. She maintained the digital storage systems that housed body camera footage, in-car recordings, dispatch logs, and internal communications. In 11 years, she had seen the inner workings of the department from an angle that most people never knew existed. She had watched footage disappear before. She had processed deletion orders that came with vague justifications and captain-level authorization signatures, and the unspoken understanding that asking questions was a career-ending decision. She had kept her head down and done her job, and collected her paycheck, and gone home to her apartment, and told herself that it was not her fight. When the deletion order for Brett Lockhart's body camera footage from the day of Nathaniel's detention crossed her desk, Sandra Hewitt looked at the authorization signature, saw Captain Douglas Langford's name, and felt something shift inside her chest. She could not explain it later when Nathaniel asked. She could not point to a single moment or a single thought that made her act differently than she had acted every time before. She said only that she was tired. Tired of knowing and not doing. Tired of being the hands that made evidence disappear. Before she executed the deletion, she copied the footage to a personal encrypted flash drive, dropped it into her purse, and went home. She carried that drive for 6 days before she found the courage to use it. Through a mutual acquaintance, a woman she had gone to church with for 15 years, she made contact with Nathaniel. They met in a parking garage on the north side of the city at 9 o'clock on a Wednesday night. Sandra Hewitt handed the flash drive to Nathaniel, and her hand trembled when she did it. She told him that what she had just done would end her career if anyone found out. She told him she did not care anymore. She told him she had a nephew who had been stopped by Lockhart 2 years ago and held at gunpoint for 12 minutes before being released without charges, and that her nephew, who was 19 at the time, had not driven a car since. She said she was giving Nathaniel the footage because somebody needed to see it. Nathaniel took the drive and told her that what she had just done was the bravest thing he had witnessed in 14 years of federal law enforcement, and he meant it. That night, alone in a darkened room at the field office, Nathaniel inserted the flash drive into a secure terminal and watched the footage from beginning to end. The body camera captured everything. Every second. The initial confrontation. The moment Lockhart drew his weapon. Nathaniel's hands in the air, his voice identifying himself as FBI. The takedown. The sound of Nathaniel's cheekbones striking pavement. The handcuffs. The racial slurs, each one captured in high-definition audio with perfect clarity. The gun pressed against the back of Nathaniel's skull. Lockhart's whispered words about black men and guns and luck running out. Fenwick's arrival, his hesitation, his quiet statement that the badge looked real, and Lockhart's sharp dismissal. Nathaniel watched himself on the screen, reliving every second, and something in his chest tightened until he thought his ribs might crack. But it was what the footage captured after the FBI team arrived that shattered the last wall. After the agents swarmed the scene and the handcuffs came off after the raid shifted to the warehouse, the body camera kept recording. It captured Lockhart stepping away from the commotion, pulling his personal cell phone from his pocket, and making a call. The call lasted 14 seconds. Lockhart's words were picked up clearly by the microphone clipped to his vest. "It is blown. Get everything out. Now." 14 seconds. 7 words. Enough to connect Brett Lockhart not just to racial profiling, not just to excessive force, but to active participation in the drug trafficking conspiracy. He had called the targets and warned them during the raid. He had blown 9 months of federal investigation with a single phone call. This was the smoking gun. But just as Nathaniel prepared to present the complete case to the U.S. Attorney's Office, Kemp walked into his office and closed the door for the second time in a month. The news was devastating. The Department of Justice was considering removing Nathaniel from the investigation. Captain Langford had been working political channels lobbying through a Virginia congressman who sat on the House Judiciary Committee. The congressman had sent a formal letter to the DOJ questioning the FBI's conduct in Richmond and alleging that Special Agent Greer had a personal vendetta against the Richmond Police Department stemming from his own detention. The letter called for an independent review of the investigation's scope and methodology. If the DOJ pulled Nathaniel off the case would collapse. No one else had the relationships with the witnesses, the institutional knowledge of the evidence, or the fire to see it through. The walls closed in from every direction simultaneously. The congressman's letter triggered an internal review at the DOJ that required Nathaniel to submit a written justification for his continued involvement in the investigation. Internal memos began circulating within the FBI that questioned his objectivity. Words like conflicted and compromised appeared in emails between Washington administrators who had never set foot in Richmond and had no understanding of what was happening on the ground. Nathaniel sat in his office at the field office and felt the full weight of a machinery designed not to find truth, but to manage liability. He was fighting the criminals who ran the drug operation. He was fighting the police officers who protected it. He was fighting the political apparatus that shielded the police. And now he was fighting his own bureaucracy, which preferred a quiet resolution to a messy confrontation. The isolation was total. And in that isolation, Nathaniel made a decision that could end his career. He contacted Lorraine Tatum. Tatum was a civil rights attorney with a national reputation that preceded her into every room she entered. She had litigated police brutality cases in Chicago, Baltimore, Minneapolis, and Houston. She had argued before the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals and won. She had testified before congressional committees and made grown men squirm under the weight of the evidence she laid before them. Describe fierce, and you described Lorraine Tatum. Describe strategic and relentless and incapable of being intimidated, and you had the full picture. Nathaniel met with Tatum in her office in downtown Richmond and made a calculated disclosure. He shared the body camera footage. He shared the non-classified evidence of the corruption the shell company documents, the property records, the pattern of retaliatory arrests. He did not share active investigative materials. He did not share grand jury proceedings or sealed documents. He walked the razor edge between whistleblowing and misconduct, fully aware that if the line was judged to be on the wrong side, his badge and his freedom were both at risk. Tatum watched the footage in silence. When it ended, she looked at Nathaniel and said only, "When do we go public?" The press conference was held on a Thursday morning on the steps of the federal courthouse in Richmond. Lorraine Tatum stood behind a podium flanked by Nathaniel Greer on one side and Jerome Dupree on the other. Cameras from every major network formed a semicircle at the base of the steps. Microphones bristled from the podium like quills. Reporters from national outlets stood shoulder to shoulder with local journalists, and behind them a crowd of community members who had heard through word of mouth that something significant was about to happen. Tatum spoke for 6 minutes before playing the footage. She laid out the pattern of complaints, the retaliatory arrests, the deleted body camera recordings. She named Lockhart. She named Langford. She named the shell company and Patricia Langford's connection to it. She presented the documented history of 17 complaints dismissed over 12 years, everyone filed by a Black or Latino man, everyone buried by the same captain. Then she turned to the screen that had been set up beside the podium and pressed play. The courthouse steps went silent. The only sound was the audio from the body camera, Lockhart's commands, Nathaniel's calm identification, the sickening impact of a man's face striking asphalt, the racial slurs delivered with casual venom, the click of handcuffs, and then the gun. The footage showed the muzzle of Lockhart's weapon pressed against the base of a federal agent's skull, while that agent lay face down and handcuffed on a public street in America. The audience heard Lockhart tell a man with a badge that black men do not get to carry guns in his district. Then the FBI team arrived, and the footage kept rolling, and every person watching in person and on every screen that would carry this moment to millions heard Brett Lockhart step away from the chaos and make a 14-second phone call. "It is blown. Get everything out. Now." The footage detonated across the country within hours. 12 million views on the first day across multiple platforms. Every major news network ran the story as breaking coverage. The footage was analyzed, discussed, replayed, and shared until it became one of those images that sears itself into the national consciousness and refuses to fade. Richmond erupted. Community members who had lived under the weight of the Lockhart's precinct for years took to the streets in organized demonstrations that grew each day. The mayor of Richmond held an emergency press conference and demanded a full independent investigation. The governor of Virginia called for a state-level review. The congressman who had been lobbying to remove Nathaniel from the investigation went completely and conspicuously silent, canceling 3 scheduled media appearances in a single afternoon. Lockhart and Langford responded with a counterattack that revealed the depth of their arrogance. Lockhart's attorney held a press conference claiming the footage had been selectively edited and digitally manipulated. Langford appeared beside his own attorney and called the entire affair a coordinated hit job by a disgruntled federal agent with a personal grudge. Then they filed a civil defamation lawsuit against Nathaniel Greer, personally seeking $2.5 million in damages. The audacity was breathtaking. The criminals were suing the man who exposed them. But in the middle of the firestorm, while the country watched and the legal machinery ground into motion, Jerome Dupree called Nathaniel with information that shattered every remaining boundary around the case. Dupree had been quietly reaching out to other members of the community who had endured encounters with Lockhart. Through this network of survivors, he had found something no one expected: a witness to a killing. 3 years earlier, a 23-year-old black man named Cedric Rawls had been shot and killed by Brett Lockhart during a traffic stop on a residential street in the South Side. The official report stated that Rawls had reached for a weapon during the stop and that Lockhart had fired in self-defense. The shooting was reviewed by Internal Affairs under Langford's authority and ruled justified. The case was closed, but Dupree had located a woman who lived in a house overlooking the intersection where the shooting occurred. She had watched the entire event from her second-floor window. She told Dupree that Cedric Rawls was standing beside his car with both hands raised above his head when Brett Lockhart fired 3 rounds into his chest. There was no weapon on Cedric. There was no weapon in his car. He was unarmed, compliant, and standing still when he was killed. The woman had remained silent for 3 years because 2 days after the shooting, 2 uniformed officers visited her home and told her that if she spoke about what she saw, her family would face consequences that she would not be able to undo. She had lived with the secret and the fear for 1,095 days. This was no longer a case about police misconduct or corruption or even drug trafficking. There was blood on Brett Lockhart's hands, and the charges that were coming would carry the weight of a life sentence. The United States Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia convened a federal grand jury in a secure courtroom on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks after the press conference. The proceedings were closed to the public and sealed by court order, and inside that room the full scope of what Brett Lockhart and Douglas Langford had built and protected for nearly a decade was laid bare in testimony and evidence that took 11 days to present. Nathaniel Greer was the lead witness. He took the stand on the first day and did not leave until the third. He walked the grand jury through every piece of evidence in methodical sequence, starting with the morning of the raid and working backward and forward through the timeline until every connection was visible and every thread was tied to every other thread. He presented the body camera footage, and the room went still when Lockhart's voice filled the silence with the 14-second phone call. He presented the financial records. The shell company and corporation documents the bank statements showing monthly cash deposits corresponding to the drug ring's revenue cycles. He presented Lockhart's patrol route maps, overlaid with the distribution network territory. He presented the 17 dismissed complaints and the pattern of retaliatory arrests that followed. Each piece of evidence was a brick, and by the time Nathaniel stepped down from the stand, the wall was high enough that no lawyer in the country could see over it. The witnesses came next, and each one required a different kind of courage. Sandra Hewitt testified about the deletion order for the body camera footage. She described receiving the order with Captain Langford's authorization signature. She described the moment she decided to make a copy before executing the deletion. She described carrying the flash drive in her purse for 6 days, the weight of it far heavier than its physical mass, before finding the strength to pass it to Nathaniel. Her voice trembled when she spoke, but she did not stop, and she did not retract a single word. Jerome Dupree took the stand and told the grand jury what had been done to him. He described the traffic stop, the illegal search, the racial slur, the complaint he filed the next morning because he believed the system would protect him. He described the arrest 12 weeks later, the sealed bag of cocaine that appeared beneath his driver's seat in a car he kept immaculately clean, the public defender who spent 11 minutes with him before the trial, the conviction, the 2 years inside Greensville Correctional Center. He described losing his wife, his apartment, his job, his credit, and his ability to trust that any institution in America had been built to serve a man who looked like him. When he finished, one of the grand jurors, an older woman in the front row, removed her glasses and pressed a tissue to her eyes. Isaiah Poindexter testified about the career that was taken from him. He described 22 years of teaching history to teenagers in a neighborhood that the rest of Richmond had forgotten. He described watching Lockhart brutalize a 16-year-old boy on the hood of a patrol car, and knowing that if he did not speak, no one would. He described filing the complaint and the arrest that followed. 11 weeks later, the charge of resisting arrest manufactured from nothing. The revocation of his teaching license the morning he cleaned out his classroom for the last time, and walked past the students who did not understand why their teacher was leaving. His voice was steady and quiet, and it carried the particular gravity of a man who had lost something that could never be fully replaced and had made peace with that loss without ever accepting that it was just. Then the eyewitness to the killing of Cedric Rawls was brought into the courtroom under federal witness protection. She was a woman in her 50s who asked that her name not be read aloud even in the sealed proceedings. She sat in the witness chair and folded her hands in her lap and told the grand jury what she had seen from her second-floor window on a warm evening 3 years ago. A young black man standing beside his car on a quiet residential street. His hands were above his head. His palms were open and facing forward. He was not moving. He was not speaking. Officer Brett Lockhart stood 8 feet away with his service weapon raised and aimed at the young man's chest. She heard Lockhart shout a command that she could not make out. The young man did not move. His hands stayed in the air. Then she heard 3 gunshots in rapid succession. The young man fell backward and did not get up. She watched Lockhart stand over the body for several seconds before reaching for his radio. She said there was no weapon on the young man, and no weapon anywhere near him. She said she watched from her window as other officers arrived, and the scene was processed, and at no point did she see any weapon recovered from the young man's body or his vehicle. She said 2 days later, 2 uniformed officers knocked on her door and told her that speaking about what she saw would result in consequences for her family. She said she had not slept through a full night in 3 years. When she finished, the silence in the courtroom lasted long enough for everyone in it to feel the weight settle onto their shoulders. The grand jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. The indictments came down like a hammer striking stone. Brett Lockhart was indicted on federal civil rights violations, evidence tampering, corruption, conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, obstruction of justice, and second-degree murder in the death of Cedric Rawls. Douglas Langford was indicted on charges of racketeering, corruption, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. 6 additional officers from the precinct were indicted on related charges, including evidence planting, filing false police reports, and witness intimidation. FBI tactical teams executed the arrest warrants simultaneously across Richmond at 6 in the morning on a Friday. Douglas Langford was arrested at his desk in the precinct headquarters. 2 agents walked through the front doors, past the reception desk, past the bullpen of officers who watched in stunned silence, and placed handcuffs on their captain while he sat in his leather chair beneath a framed commendation from the city council. 4 of the 6 indicted officers were taken into custody at their homes without incident. Derek Fenwick, the young officer who had written the coached statement, was arrested at his apartment. He did not resist. He did not speak. He simply held out his wrists and closed his eyes. But Brett Lockhart refused to surrender. When the FBI tactical team arrived at his lakefront property in Chesterfield County at 6 in the morning, Lockhart's wife answered the door and said he was not coming out. The front door closed. The blinds dropped. A standoff began. Negotiators established phone contact within the first hour. Lockhart's voice came through the line, belligerent and erratic, swinging between legal threats, personal insults, and moments of silence that stretched long enough to raise concerns about his mental state. The standoff lasted through the morning and into the afternoon, and then into the evening. At 9:47 that night, nearly 16 hours into the standoff, Lockhart called Nathaniel Greer directly on his personal cell phone. Nathaniel answered and heard a voice he recognized, but barely. It was ragged, stripped of the arrogance that had defined every previous encounter, replaced by something unstable and desperate. Lockhart told Nathaniel he had information that would destroy him. He said he had proof that Nathaniel's cousin Terrence Stokes, the one who died of the fentanyl overdose, was not an innocent victim. He claimed Terrence was a dealer who had been working for the drug ring. He said he would release this information to every news outlet in the country unless Nathaniel backed off. He said Nathaniel's entire crusade was built on a lie that the cousin he mourned was the same kind of criminal Nathaniel was trying to put away. For a moment, that felt like falling. Nathaniel's composure cracked. He sat in his car outside the Chesterfield perimeter and felt the ground shift beneath the foundation of everything he had done for the past year. Terrence, the cousin he loved, the death that had pulled him into this world, the grief that had become purpose. Could it be true? Was the man he had been honoring with every late night and every risk and every sacrifice nothing more than another player in the machine Nathaniel was trying to dismantle? The question hung in the air, and Nathaniel had no answer for it, and for the first time since the morning he woke up and drove to the warehouse, he did not know what to believe. Brett Lockhart surrendered at 11:22 the following morning after more than 26 hours barricaded inside his home. He walked out the front door with his hands raised and was taken into federal custody without further incident. The legal proceedings began immediately. But Nathaniel could not rest because Lockhart's final claim had planted something inside him that would not stop growing a seed of doubt that wrapped its roots around every memory he had of Terrence and squeezed. He began pulling every record he could access regarding Terrence's final months. Employment records, phone records, financial statements, associates, movements. He dug with the same relentless precision he had applied to the corruption case, except now the subject was someone he loved, and every document he opened carried the possibility of shattering the image of a man he had been carrying in his heart for a year. What Nathaniel found did not destroy him. It transformed him in ways he would spend the rest of his life understanding, through classified FBI files that had been compartmentalized outside his clearance level until Kemp authorized access. As part of the expanded investigation, Nathaniel learned the truth about his cousin. Terrence Stokes was not a drug dealer. He was a confidential FBI informant. For 2 years before his death, Terrence had been feeding intelligence to the FBI's Organized Crime Division regarding the drug trafficking operation on Richmond's South Side. He had been recruited because of his past, because his history of addiction gave him access to circles that no agent could penetrate without cover. Terrence had been working from the inside, gathering evidence at enormous personal risk, attending meetings, recording conversations, mapping distribution routes. He did this knowing that if he was discovered, there would be no rescue team, no extraction plan, no cavalry coming over the hill. He did it anyway. Nathaniel did not know because informant identities were compartmentalized with absolute strictness. The agents running the drug task force did not know who the informants were for the Organized Crime Division. The walls between units existed precisely to prevent a leak in one division from compromising assets in another. Terrence had been invisible even to the cousin who worked 3 floors above him in the same building. The classified files revealed the final truth, and it was the truth that would determine the rest of Brett Lockhart's life. 8 months before the story began, Lockhart discovered through his contacts within the drug ring that someone inside the operation was passing information to the FBI. Through a process of elimination that took several weeks, Lockhart identified Terrence Stokes as the source. But Lockhart could not expose Terrence through official channels because doing so would reveal Lockhart's own involvement with the drug ring. He could not report an informant without explaining how he knew the informant existed. So Lockhart arranged a different kind of solution. Through the drug operations supply chain, Lockhart ensured that Terrence received a sample of fentanyl that had been concentrated to lethal levels. The dose was disguised as a routine quality sample of the kind that moved through the network regularly. Terrence, who had maintained his cover by handling product as part of his informant role, was exposed to the lethal concentration. He died in a motel bathroom. The scene was staged to look like a relapse. The needle, the residue, the tragic but familiar story of a man who could not stay clean. The medical examiner ruled accidental overdose. The FBI lost their informant and never determined the true cause. Until now. This revelation was incorporated into the federal case against Brett Lockhart. The charge of second-degree murder in the death of Cedric Rawls was joined by a charge of first-degree murder in the death of Terrence Stokes, with special circumstances of murder committed in furtherance of a criminal enterprise. The trial consumed 7 weeks and generated national media coverage that did not diminish for a single day. The verdict came on a Friday afternoon in October. Brett Lockhart was convicted on every count: civil rights violations, evidence tampering, corruption, conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, obstruction of justice, second-degree murder in the death of Cedric Rawls, first-degree murder in the death of Terrence Stokes. He was sentenced to life in federal prison, without the possibility of parole. When the sentence was read, Lockhart stood motionless in the courtroom, and for the first time since Nathaniel had encountered him on that scorching street, Lockhart had nothing to say. Douglas Langford was convicted of racketeering corruption, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 28 years. His wife, Patricia, was convicted of money laundering and received a sentence of 9 years. The 6 additional officers received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years, depending on their level of involvement. The drug trafficking operation collapsed entirely within 3 months of the arrests. Jerome Dupree's conviction was vacated by a federal judge who wrote a 12-page opinion calling the original prosecution a manufactured injustice. His record was expunged. He received compensation from the city of Richmond and used it to open his own auto repair shop on Hull Street, 4 blocks from where he had worked before his life was stolen. Isaiah Poindexter's arrest record was cleared. His teaching license was reinstated by the State Board of Education. He returned to the classroom the following semester, and on his first day back, the students who remembered him lined the hallway and applauded as he walked to his room. The family of Cedric Rawls received a federal civil rights settlement. A memorial bench was installed at the intersection where Cedric died, and his name was engraved in brass that caught the sunlight every afternoon. A federal consent decree was imposed on the Richmond Police Department, mandating independent civilian oversight, mandatory bias training, restructured complaint procedures, body camera policies, with independent storage, and a complete review of every complaint dismissed under Douglas Langford's authority. Nathaniel Greer was promoted to supervisory special agent. But the promotion was not the ending. On a quiet morning in early November, Nathaniel drove to the cemetery on the eastern edge of Richmond, where Terence Stokes was buried. He went alone. The air was cool, and the trees had turned, and the leaves scattered across the grass in patterns of gold and rust. He stood in front of the headstone and he spoke to his cousin. He told Terence what he had learned. That Terence was not a victim of addiction. He was not a man who lost his battle. He was a soldier. He was a man who walked into the fire every single day, knowing he might not walk out. And he did it because he believed that the community he came from deserved better than the poison that was destroying it. Nathaniel told Terence that every piece of intelligence he gathered before his death, every recording, every name, every route he mapped, became part of the foundation that brought down the people who killed him. The information Terence collected was woven into the same case files that Nathaniel used to build Operation Clean Sweep. Terence's work did not die with him. It lived. It grew. It became the weapon that destroyed the very people who ended his life. Nathaniel removed the FBI service pin from his own lapel and placed it on the headstone. The full circle was complete. Lockhart murdered Terence to protect himself. But Terence's death was what drove Nathaniel to join the drug task force. Nathaniel's presence at the warehouse was what led to the confrontation with Lockhart. The confrontation was what triggered the investigation. The investigation was what exposed the corruption. The corruption case was what uncovered the murders. Every act of cruelty Lockhart committed built another link in the chain that ultimately bound him. The man who pressed a gun to Nathaniel's skull and told him that black men do not get to carry guns in his district was now locked in a cell for the rest of his natural life, put there by the very black man he tried to destroy, carrying the badge of the cousin he murdered. Nathaniel stood at the grave for a long time. Then he turned and walked back across the cemetery toward the parking lot where Camille and their 2 children were waiting in the car. His son saw him coming and waved through the window. His daughter pressed her face against the glass and smiled. Nathaniel walked toward them, and he did not look back. He did not need to. Justice did not arrive quickly. It did not arrive cleanly. It stumbled and bled and nearly collapsed under the weight of a system that was built to protect the powerful and silence the powerless. But it arrived. And it arrived because one man refused to let racism define his truth, silence his purpose, or break his body on a burning stretch of asphalt in Richmond, Virginia. And now a question that matters. Have you ever witnessed someone being treated unjustly because of their race, their appearance, or their identity? And if so, what did you do and what do you wish you had done? Leave your answer in the comments, because stories like this do not live on screens. They live in the conversations we have after the screen goes dark. If this story moved you, hit the like button so more people can find it. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story that needs to be told. And share this with someone who needs to hear it, because the truth only has power when it reaches the people willing to carry it forward. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you for believing that stories about justice